All right, so welcome to the second lecture of week 9 of Introduction to Logic 1500.0 or Philosophy 1500.02. Yeah, right. So anyway, this is our second lecture, right? And we're going to continue talking about categorical propositions. This corresponds to 4.2 in the book, right? And this time we're going to talk about quality, quantity, and distribution, and also the types of categorical propositions. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so sort of big ideas that we're going to talk about in this lecture, right? There are 4 types of categorical propositions. They have letters as names, A, E, I, and O, right? You can read about this in the book. Anyway, there are 2 quantities of categorical propositions, universal and particular. There are 2 qualities of categorical propositions, affirmative and negative, right? Make sure you keep quantity and quality separate. And then finally, terms are distributed. So we're going to talk about all of this. Yeah, good. So very briefly, 4 types of categorical propositions, A, E, I, and O, right? So think back to the last lecture. We talked about, well, 4 different types of categorical propositions, right? So all SRP, no SRP, some S are P, and some S are not P, right? Where S and P stand for subject term and predicate term, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Second, quantity, right? So this has to do with what or how much of like a class of things of the subject term the categorical proposition is about or makes a claim about, right? Again, we'll talk about that in a bit. Qualities, does the categorical proposition say that something or some things have or lack or don't have, rather, some property? And then terms are distributed. We'll get to it. Okay, so let's move in. All right, so think back to our 4 types of propositions, or our 4 propositions that we were using last time, or categorical propositions, rather. All governments that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism. No vampire movies or films without blood. Some symphony orchestras are organizations on the brink of bankruptcy, and some CIA operatives are not champions of human rights. Okay, so each of these is an instance of a different type of categorical proposition. So all governments that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism. That's of type A. No vampire movies or films without blood. That's of type E. Some symphony orchestras or organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. That's of type I. And some CIA operatives are not champions of human rights. That's of type O. Right, so what's going on here, right, is the following, right? So these are all instances of this more general, or of these more general types. So all governments that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism. This is an instance of all S are P, right, where S and P stand for subject term and predicate term, respectively. No vampire movies or films without blood. This is an instance of type E. No SRP, right? I is an instance of some SRP, and O is an instance of some S are not P. So here's our type A proposition again. So here's an example of a type A proposition. All governments that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism, right? So all S are P. The quantity here is universal, right? So it's universal in the following sense. It makes a claim about every one of the governments that bargain with terrorists. Not just some of them, but all of them, right? Every one of them, right? So quantity is a feature of the subject term, right? Does it say something about all of the members of the class of the subject term? Right, so here this tells us that every one of the governments, right, that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism, right? So it's making a claim about all of the subject terms, or all of the things in the subject term category or class or set or whatever, group. Next we have quality. the quality of this is affirmative, right? So it makes the claim that all the governments that bargain with terrorists are among the class of governments that encourage terrorism. So it affirms class membership. That's what quality has to do with, right? Whether it tells us that some things are in a certain class or out of a certain class. And then distributed term is the subject term, right? So the proposition says something about every member of the class of the subject term, right? So to figure out which term, if any, is distributed in one of these, we're going to see if the proposition says something about every member of the class, right? So in some, the predicate will be distributed. In some, both the subject and the predicate will be distributed. And in others, actually just one, neither will be distributed. But we'll have to get to those types of propositions here in a moment. Next we have our type E, no vampire movies or films without blood. So again, the quantity is universal, right? So it makes a claim about every one of the vampire movies, right? So it's a claim about the subject term again, right? And it says that every one of those, right, those vampire movies are not, right, films without blood. Okay. Next we have quality, right, which is negative. So it makes a claim that none of the vampire movies are among the class of films without blood. So it denies class membership, right? It tells us that all of the vampire movies, right, are not among the class of things that are films without blood. And then finally, distributed term. In this case, both the subject and the predicate term. Right, so the proposition says something about every member of the class of the subject term and the predicate term. None of the vampire movies are among the films without blood, right? And none of the films without blood include vampire movies. Next we have I. Some symphony orchestras are organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. So quantity here is particular, right? So it's making a claim about some of the symphony orchestras, right? So this again is a claim about the subject term. Right? It's not saying that all symphony orchestras are organizations on the brink of bankruptcy, just some. Although, right, it is consistent with all of them being on the brink of bankruptcy, but that's not what I says, right? I just says that some of them are. Quality here is affirmative, right? So it makes a claim that some of the symphony orchestras are among the class of organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. So it affirms class membership. It says that there are some things that are symphony orchestras and they're members of the class of organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. And then finally, distributed term, none, right? The proposition doesn't say anything at all about every member of either class, right? It doesn't make a claim about all of the symphony orchestras, right? And it doesn't make a claim about all of the organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. And finally, we have O. Some CIA operatives are not champions of human rights. Quantity here is particular, right? So it makes a claim only about some of the CIA operatives, right? Again, a claim about the subject term. It doesn't make a claim about all of them. Next, we have quality. Again, this is negative, right? So it makes the claim that at least one of the CIA operatives is not among the class of champions of human rights. Right? So it denies class membership. It's telling us something like there is at least one CIA operative that's not in the class of champions of human rights. And then finally, distributed term, champions of human rights, right? The predicate term, right? So the claim here is that the proposition says something like, among all of the champions of human rights, right? Consider all of them, right? The entire class. There's at least one CIA operative that's not in that class. All right, so here is a way to depict the information that we've already gone over, right? So we have our four propositions, four types, right? All S are P, no S are P, some S are P, and some S are not P. All S are P, the letter type is A, its quantity is universal, its quality is affirmative, and the distributed term is S, the subject. Right, next we have no SRP, this is of type E, its quantity is universal, its quality is negative, and the distributed terms are both the subject and the predicate terms. Next we have the proposition some SRP, right, this is of letter type I. Its quantity is particular, its quality is affirmative, and the distributed term is none. Right? It doesn't distribute any of the terms, right? Because it's not making a claim about all of the members of either class. Right? And then some S are not P is of letter type O, its quantity is particular, its quality is negative, and the distributed term is P. So let's do some quick practice, right? So what's the letter, quantity, quality, and distributed term of the following? Some students are people who procrastinate. Well, this is something you should do on your own. So I'll give you a second to do that. So the letter is I, right? It's of the form some S are P, right? Some students are people who procrastinate. Its quantity is particular, right? Because it's of letter I. Right. So actually, let's sort of say a little bit more there. Why is the quantity particular? Okay, so I take it you were supposed to answer during that pause. I hope you did. But the idea here is that the statement doesn't make a claim about all of the members of the class of students, right? It just says that some students are people who procrastinate, right? So it's particular rather than universal. It doesn't say anything about all of the students, right? Its quality is affirmative, right? So why is that? So it affirms class membership, right? So it's telling us that consider the class of people who procrastinate. There's at least one student who's a member of that class, and its distributed term is none, right? It doesn't make a claim about all of the students or about all of the people who procrastinate.